But this governance model has 4 layers, 4 levels in the organization, and which isn't the flattest possible, which would just be 2, right? A leader and everybody doing stuff, but it's way flatter than what most of our churches have been used to. But the more important thing, and I want you to pay attention to this or listen for this as we go through this, is that the layers are doing different things in this system than what you're used to. So you'll hear the word church council, and you'll make a whole lot of assumptions about what the church council is doing. Listen as I talk about it for how different what they're doing is, okay? Because we're using words that mean a different thing in this system than they do in the way you're used to. So the 4 layers are the charge conference is the furthest from the edge. That's the annual meeting, and it's the body that the discipline says is the ultimate authority of the local congregation. The second layer is the church council and the committee on leadership and nominations. Those 2 committees are at the same level of organization, but they have very different functions. We'll talk about these in detail. Third level is staff, and I'll talk about that in much greater detail. But by staff, I mean every person who leads a ministry team. So if there is a group of people doing something, they have a leader, and that person is staff. So staff does not mean you're paid. Some staff are paid, some staff are not paid. But there are also maybe paid people who are not staff. So for example, you might have a janitor who's paid, but that's not a staff person necessarily, if they're not leading a ministry team, okay? So when I use the word staff, and I'll keep saying this over and over, I mean people who are leading a ministry team and carrying out a ministry, okay? By the way, you might have a paid janitor who isn't a staff person, and that would be if they coordinate 5 or 6 volunteers who together keep the building clean, right? You see the distinction? If you're paying somebody to come and clean the toilets and vacuum, that's not a staff person. That's a hired hand. If you're paying somebody who cleans the church but also coordinates 5 or 6 volunteers who come and help with that, that's a staff person. Okay, that's what I mean by staff. And then ministry teams are all those groups of people who do stuff in the church. And I always like to say, again and again and again, you'll hear me say it more than once this afternoon, if something is happening, there's a ministry team. Right? Don't think specifically organized, clearly organized. If something's happening around this church or because of this church, there's probably a ministry team doing it, and we probably haven't thought about the fact that there is.
Can one person be a team?
No.
Okay.
Right? Because there are also, and my favorite example of this, actually highlights the nuances, is communion steward. Okay, lots of churches have someone who brings the bread and the grape juice and sets it up every time there's a communion Sunday. So most of the time, that person just does it. They know to do it the first Sunday of every month. I've been pastor at churches where I didn't even have to talk to them more than a couple times a year about it because they did it, it showed up, unless there was a special thing going on, they knew what to do, and so on. That's not a ministry team. That's a minister, okay? However, that person could be considered to be on a ministry team, the worship team, right? Just like Catherine was, who came in every Tuesday. In my church in McMinnville, my office would have been that door right straight back there. And there's a narthex just like this, and then the sanctuary like this. And Catherine came every Tuesday about 9 in the morning, dark, only person in the room, and she went through the whole sanctuary and put all the golf pencils in the things, made sure they were there, took the bulletins and recycled them, closed the hymnals up, put them in the racks, made sure there wasn't anything on the floor, and about once a month dusted right? All by herself, completely ungoverned by anybody, but she was definitely on the...
And she was good at it.
But she was on the worship ministry team, and actually one of the things that it makes makes life together more powerful is when the community knows that the worship team includes Catherine, right? Because some of those people who think, oh, I'm kind of an introvert and I don't want to teach a Sunday school class, so I'm not a minister, begin to learn, oh, actually there are ministries for people like me and ministry teams that I can be part of without having to go to meetings, right? So, but that's ministry teams, but ministry team leaders, staff people, lead a group of people in coordinating that work.
So every ministry team then would have a leader,
Yes,
and that would be on the staff level on your third tier there.
correct. Yep. So if there's a group of people, somebody has to be coordinating that, and that person is on the third level. They are a staff person. And by the way, in churches, some of your people are going to show up on every layer, right? It's not like you can only be in one place. It's just that when you're in that place, you know what you're supposed to be doing in that role. Yep, exactly right. Okay, so let's talk about them in particular, okay? First is the charge conference. Remember I said you need to know the responsibility, the authority, and the accountability, right? We talked about that? So what's the responsibility of the charge conference? Well, first you can find out about that in paragraphs 246, 247, 249, 250, and 251 in your discipline, which I'm sure you all have in your lap, right? So that's just for you geeks who want to go look at the discipline to make sure I know what I'm talking about. What's the responsibility of the charge conference? The responsibility of the charge conference is to fulfill the mission of the United Methodist Church. You may not have thought about this way, but the United Methodist Church is a franchise. And you notice it's not, the charge conference is not called the church conference in the discipline, it's called a charge conference. And that's because as we were moving west and the Methodist movement was expanding, pastors were assigned to charges, and the charge was all the places that you're supposed to go before you come back to annual conference next year, right? So it was more like what we would call a circuit. And so a pastor was sent to a charge, and charges had names like the Lakeview Circuit, which was all of southeastern Oregon. There's now Lakeview United Methodist Church, Klamath Falls United Methodist Church, Paisley United Methodist Church. There's a bunch of churches in it. But when it first started, that was just the Lakeview Charge. And a pastor took the train to Eugene, got off the train, and walked to southeastern Oregon over the Cascade Mountains to go to his charge and find the Methodists there and connect them up and care for the mission. Right? So the charge conference is the meeting of a charge at which the superintendent came and said, how are you doing at fulfilling the mission of the church in this place? It was an accountability meeting. That's why you can't have a charge conference without the district superintendent calling it, because it's an accountability meeting. We don't do it that way at all anymore, but that's how they worked. As the DS came and said to you all, who are the leaders of the church, of the charge there, of the mission there, how are you doing at carrying out the mission of the United Methodist Church, which, by the way, is in the discipline, and it's making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Nobody buys a McDonald's franchise and then says, now, what shall we sell? How about tires? Right? A franchise is you are entrusted in that place with this, with our like an expression of us there, right? And so Camas United Methodist Church is actually entrusted in Camas with the mission of the United Methodist Church. So the responsibility is the mission. The authority of the charge conference is that it speaks for and answers for the congregation here, right? So when the superintendent comes to the charge conference speaks to the superintendent on behalf of those people who are enrolled in the mission here. That's their authority. When the TS says, for example, well, how much can you afford to support the pastor who circulates through this area? Remember, it was originally a circuit. They said $12 next year. And they spoke for the congregation. The DS trusted them for that, right? And then went back and said, George, we'd like you to go out into the Southwest Vancouver charge, and all the churches added together is $42 next year. That's what you'll get, right? So in various ways, the charge conference has the authority to speak on behalf of the congregation. That's what they are empowered to do. Their accountability is to the conference. We're a connectional church, not a congregational polity church. And I assume you all know that if you decided to discontinue, the building would belong to the Pacific Northwest Conference automatically, instantly. And as a matter of fact, that as a church, you couldn't vote to make it into a, you know what, that we're kind of tired of being church, let's be the Camas Third Avenue Social Club. You couldn't do it, right? You couldn't change to something else with the assets of the church here because they're entrusted to you. It's actually a trust clause. It's entrusted to you for Methodist ministry. So that's the charge conference. Responsibility of the mission, authority speaks on behalf of the congregation, accountability of the conference. The members of the charge conference are all the members of the church council, the retired clergy who are associated with the congregation, and deacons, if any, and elected honorary members, if any. That's the discipline. Right? Now, you have probably been having all church conferences for a number of years, which is an alternative in the discipline that allows for an all church meeting instead if the DS wants to allow that. In the Pacific Northwest and in Oregon, Idaho, most of the Western conferences, for about the past 40 years, it's been kind of standard practice to have an all church meeting instead of a charge conference. But for now, I just want to highlight what we want to do is go back to a charge conference in this structure. Okay? We'll talk more about that and I'll explain it better. But for now, it meets annually or is needed for disciplinary responsibilities. Right now you meet once a year, but if, for example, the church decided to sell this location and move to the edge of town and build a new church building, you'd have to have a charge conference to make that decision. So there are other times occasionally when a special conference has to be called. Another thing you have to call a charge conference to do is change the compensation package for the pastor. So sometimes there's more than one in a year, but the normal pattern is one a year. Does that make sense to you so far? Did that ring any bells? I do want to highlight that paragraph 247, in those paragraphs that are listed there is all descriptions of the church council, administrative board, council on ministries, finance committee, trustees, staff parish relations committee. All those committees are described in those paragraphs. But starting in 2004, paragraph 247 was added, which says, local congregations are empowered to organize in any manner necessary to carry out their mission. Right? So paragraph 247 says, if all of that other stuff doesn't help you with your mission, you don't have to do all that other stuff. That's where the authorization comes to go to the kind of structure we're going to share. Okay, so paragraph 247 says you can organize the way you need to carry out your mission, and that's the authorization for what we're about to do. Okay, so the next level from the charge conference is the church council. And so now we're talking about a specific proposal, right? This is the way we suggest you might want to do this. And so the church council in this model has 13 members. They are the lay leader council chair. So one of the things we highly recommend if you go to a simpler structure is that instead of having a lay leader and a council chair, you have one person who is your lay leader council chair. Remember when we said if somebody's not responsible, then nobody's responsible? This gets rid of some of that weirdness, that the lay leader is responsible for what, and the church council chair is responsible for what. It says, well, here's what that person, because it's one now, is responsible for. Chairing the council and being the key lay leader, the lay person who is in virtually equal partnership with the pastor in leading the congregation. Second, you're lay member to the annual conference. That's that elected person who goes off to annual conference every year. It's a 4-year term. Some churches who do this say, let's make those 3 things one person. Let's have our lay leader council chair be the person who goes to annual conference. That's fine. You can do that if you want. Some churches say we can hardly get anybody to go off for that conference thing, so let's make that be somebody else. Third person on the council, we're saying would be the past or next lay leader. Have any of you ever been a part of a social club or a service club or something like that where on the board is the president and the past president, right?
Yeah.
Or in some clubs, it's the president and the president-elect, right? So, but either way, what they're saying is, to do this job, it either helps to have the last person there as your coach, or it helps to be there with the current person, so by the time you get the job, you know what you're doing. So we're saying, that's a good plan, let's do that. Okay? Past or next lay leader, whichever one seems to work better for you. Next person on the council is the pastor. This isn't an issue for you guys and wouldn't be for quite a while, I don't imagine, but if the church has 3 pastors, a senior and 2 associates, it's just one of the pastors. And again, if the link between the council's work and the ministry teams needs to be one person, not 3 people. Okay? So, one pastor. I mean, most churches only have one, so that's not a problem. And then finally, 9 additional persons elected in 3-year classes of 3 for 3-year terms. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying there? So, so that's 13 people.
Or less, depending on how you combine some.
Exactly. If you ended up saying our lay member at annual conference is also our chair and my leader, it'd be 12. Exactly.
And you said as few as 6 is possible on that structure?
Well, in our conferences right now, this is pre-approved. If you voted, let's do that structure, your DS would say that's fine. If you wanted to change it from this, you can, but you'd want to talk to your superintendent about whether that's okay with the bishop and the superintendent. In terms of how human communities work, it will not work to have less than 6 people at this level. No matter how, if the church only had 12 people in it, you'd still need at least 6 here. You can't do the work that we'll be talking about in a minute if you don't have at least 6. And if you have more than 15, you can't do this work. As a matter of fact, and many of you may have experienced this, I've been in churches that had as many as 30 people on the church council, but I've never been in a church that had more than 18 average attendance. Because when you have too many people, people just quit coming because you cannot have a strategic discussion with 30 people. And the bad thing about 30 on the committee and only 18 present on average is it's always a different 18, which means you never get from one step to the next. You're starting over every time because this time it's 10 who were here last time, and the other 8 are a different 8 than the 8 that were there last time. So, 13. Responsibility is to tend the vision of the congregation. Now, we'll talk in more detail, but right now your church council's authority that it's exercising is managing all the ministries. Right now your council is managing the ministries. In this, your council will be tending the vision. And we'll talk specifically about what I mean by that. But today Rashinda actually nicely in her sermon for me laid out what the vision is. It's who are we sent to reach? How will those people be disciples and be transforming the world? And what are the ministries that we're going to do in order to help those people become those disciples and change the world? That's what the vision is. We'll talk about that some more. What's the authority of the church council? They will set the budget. They will deploy the key personnel. So in other words, they will say to the pastor, together, the council will work this out, what's the main thing we need you to accomplish? Remember, you have to have the responsibility clear. The council will help the pastor understand what the responsibility clearly is for what our goals are in the coming year. And they'll set major strategy. So things like, is it time for us to go to a second worship service? And if so, why? Who's it aimed at? And how will that happen? And the accountability of the church council is to the mission of the United Methodist Church and to the congregation who, I'll explain this as briefly as I can. If the council starts to decide things and set directions and claim a vision that the congregation does not support, it won't happen. Right? They don't have to fire you. They will just sit on their hands and watch you dance around while nothing happens. Right? So that accountability is direct. The council's job is to read the congregation's readiness, willingness, capacity, and to coordinate it into effective mission. And that means you have to know the congregation. So the congregation should elect leaders who know them, and they should then follow them. They need to trust them enough to follow that lead. But the accountability is very direct. I often say, we pay a lot of attention to who gets to vote, but votes happen all the time that don't have any consequence. I mean, how many times has the church voted to do something that never happened, right? But people vote every Sunday by showing up or not. They vote every Sunday by supporting with their money or not. Those are the powerful votes that your congregation exercise. They give their lives to what you're calling them to, or they don't. That's the vote that really matters. And that's where the accountability of the council is to the congregation, is if you lose touch with them, it won't matter what you decide. It won't happen. Understood? Makes sense? How do they do their work? This will surprise you a little bit, maybe. It meets 4 times a year. 4 times a year. It holds an annual all-church meeting in addition to that, so that's kind of 5. It may have town hall meetings, focus groups, or other listening settings as needed to remain in touch with the congregation on significant issues. Okay, let's talk about those 4 meetings, those 5 meetings. The first meeting, and I'm going to give you some calendar geography to this, but you could shift it. But the order matters, right? So it does need to go in this cycle, but it doesn't really matter whether you start in January or you start on July 1st or whatever. But this is the order. The first meeting every year, which I like to call Looking Up, that's my cute little name for it. The council meets together with including its new members. So this would be the first one when new board members come on. And they look at leadership development. So how do we do our work? What does it mean to be on our church council? And what's our responsibility? How do we fit into the whole system? It orients us to the mission, vision, and values. So every year we look again at what's our mission? What's our vision? Is our vision still accurate, or has it shifted a little bit? Mission is solid and almost permanent. Making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world is not something that changes every year. But the answer to the question, who's God sending us to right now, that can shift. So can, what's our definition of a disciple? So can, what are the things that we should be doing to make that work? And so the vision needs to be looked at every year, and you're not going to change it every year, but you're going to look at it again and say, is this still true? Is this still who we are? Is this still what God is sending us? Or have we learned something in the past year that changes that? So let me give you an example. My church in McMinnville decided that who we were being sent to was middle-aged professionals in McMinnville. It's a town that a lot of people like to live in. They have to have reasonably good incomes to live there. A lot of educators. There's a college there. We have professors, school principals, teachers. And we said, who is God sending us to? Well, people like us. We see them all the time. We know how to talk to them. We know what they're interested in. These are the people that we should be claiming as disciples and helping to become that. We know how to do that. And so we started being intentional about that. The programs and the ministries and the worship style and all those things were aimed at those people. And it worked. And the church was growing pretty significantly. And one year at this meeting, we sat down for this meeting and started doing our work. And we realized that there were about 10 Linfield college students going to church now. Well, we didn't have any intentional programming for college people or young adults. But we went, wait a minute, they're showing up. We need to broaden our vision. Now it includes college students. So we have to be intentional about our ministries to them. So that's what I mean by the vision shifting. We also, at the very beginning of that work, somebody said, we ought to be reaching out to the Hispanic population in our town, 22%. I said, anybody know Spanish? No. Anybody have any friends who are Hispanic? No. Well, maybe we're not really going to be very good at that yet. But about 5 years in, there were 2 Hispanic men who had married Anglo women who were in the congregation. Both school teachers, right? So they overlapped with our mission, our vision as middle-aged, as young professionals, but suddenly we had this connection to the Hispanic community. So we began to say, wait a minute, now we are being called to engage with the Hispanic community. And that church now, 5 years, 6 years down the road from that, I've long been gone from there, has a pretty significant Hispanic ministry. So the vision, you start being intentional and it grows. So you have to look at it every year. Then policy review, what are our policies and how do we, are they good and do we know what they are? Clear? Second meeting, looking back. We usually do that in about March. By then we had last year's statistics, right? How did the finances go last year? What was the attendance stuff? How are our programs doing? We evaluated last year. How did we do on our goals? And if we hadn't set goals, which nobody has when they first start this process, then you just say, how did it go last year? What worked great? What did we struggle with? You can do that even if you didn't have goals. You can still evaluate how we did last year. So second meeting, looking back, is evaluation. Third meeting, somewhere around June, late May, June, we called looking around. And that's, have any of you done SWOT analysis in any of your other parts of your life? You make a grid, and it's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges is the word I would use. Threats is the secular term. So the top 2, strengths and weaknesses, are internal. As a church, what are our strengths right now in May? What's working well? What's strong? Where are we clicking on all 8 cylinders? Weaknesses are, right now in May, what are we struggling with? We keep trying this Sunday school thing and there's only 2 kids and it's frustrating. Whatever. I don't know. Our staff is exhausted. What are our weaknesses? The bottom 2, opportunities and threats, or opportunities and challenges, are external. In our community, in our mission field, what's going on that presents opportunities to our mission, right? So, for example, they just opened a new housing development. There's a whole lot of new families moving in across the street. That would be you might say that's an opportunity, or you might say it's a threat. Traffic's going to get horrible and we don't have enough parking on the street, right? And same thing with threats. What's going on in our mission field? One year in McMinnville, part of the discussion we had around that part was Cascade Rolling Mills just laid off 300 people, shut down a whole shift, right? Nobody works, none of our people work there, but in our community, that's going to be a big economic issue, and we have a food bank and we have food ministries, so we need to be prepared for what that will mean in terms of our addressing that situation. So that's the third meeting, looking around. And we don't decide on strategies or reactions. We're just trying to say, do we understand who we are and the community that we're in mission to? And the fourth meeting each year is looking forward. And that is in September, and the council says, okay, knowing what we know about how we did last year and what's going on right now this year, what are the 1 or 2 or 3 major goals that we think God wants us to accomplish in the year to come, in the coming year? And given that that's what God wants us to do, what should our budget be? How do we divide up the money that we've got? How should we use our staff, our senior pastor and our key leaders, right? So that year I mentioned the college students. That church had 2 pastors, one of whom was very strongly involved in supporting and encouraging our Habitat for Humanity ministry. And the church said, that's going really well. Plenty of lay people that know how to do that, don't need pastoral support now, so we want you to withdraw your work with Habitat. We'll keep doing that, but we don't need you. And your job next year is to find a way to initiate a college-age young adult ministry. Because what you can't do is say, let's add something to everybody's job description. Right? That's what we usually do. So there's serious discussion about if we have a goal that requires attention, where's that going to come from? From our leaders, from our budget, and so on. And by the way, some things you don't need budget, or some things don't need a leader, right? But you struggle with that, so that you're not just making up fantasy goals, you're actually strategizing how will we move towards those things. Then the all-church meeting follows that meeting. I don't mean the next hour. I mean sometime after that meeting. The all-church meeting is called by the board, by the church council. The church council is in charge of that meeting. Superintendent doesn't have to be there, right? This is not your church conference. This is your annual all-church meeting. And at the all-church meeting, the council shares with the church, how did we do? What's going on right now among us? What do we see as our strengths and our challenges? And what do we think God is calling us to in the year to come? And here's how we intend to spend the budget. And here's how we intend to deploy our leaders. And then the church elects its leaders, right? So you have your nominations and elections at that meeting. You might have the church adopt its budget. Some churches like to vote on budgets. Some churches say, well, if you vote on the budget, then you'd have to unvote it if anything changed, like only half the money came in. So let's don't vote on the budget, but let's discuss it or whatever. That's up to you. It doesn't matter. But the idea here is that the council is going to the church and saying, this is where we think we are as a church. This is where we think we should be going. This is how we think we're going to get there next year. And the church should be saying, amen, that's us. Let's do it. Right? Following? That'll happen if they elect the right council. Right? They will go, oh yeah, that's right. That's us. We weren't thinking about all of that way because our leaders are thinking this through for us, but that immediately we recognize that as true and valuable. And I will say, I've been in a church that for 10 years did this every year, and every year the church said amen. And we went from a $180,000 a year budget to a $350,000 a year budget plus $150,000 in direct mission over that 10-year period. I mean, it matters when you do this well. Because you're actually reading your congregation, identifying their mission, and articulating it to them. They buy in. So that's your all-church meeting. And then occasionally you're going to do listening events. So your council just suppose that at the looking around meeting, a couple of your people at that meeting said, we toured the church on Sunday morning 3 Sundays in a row during worship. And we found out that every room in the building was jam-packed because all the little kids in Sunday school and all that stuff, there's no room for any more people. And, as I noticed this morning, parking was a problem. Right? So, we need to do something about that. Because when you get to this level, you'll quit getting people if it's too hard to be here. So we could go to 2 services, or we could build a new Sunday school wing. We could buy that old house next door for a parking space, whatever, right? And the council might talk about that when they're looking forward and setting goals and go, you know what, we don't know what the church would want to do. We're not sure. We're afraid they would say, we don't want to do fundraising right now. We don't want to have to raise $500,000 for a building project. They might say, we don't want to go to 2 worship services. We'll divide the congregation in 2 if we do that, right? So there's a limited number of things we could do. We aren't sure which way they'd want to go. So let's have a town hall meeting. Actually, let's have 2 of them. The next 2 Sundays after church about our space issues. And the council would present to the church. Here's the issue. We're up to the gills here. We have to do something about that. We could go to 2 worship services. We could go into a building project and probably take about $500,000 to do the kinds of things that we think would be necessary. What do you think? And the church talks about it. They don't vote. There's not a proposal. It's a town hall. It's holy conferencing is what Wesley called it. And the council listens to that, and then they go have a meeting and they say, well, the church said, how about if we start a new congregation on the other side of town? That's what they want to do. Right, to keep growing. So maybe an idea comes out the council didn't even have. Or maybe they say, well, there weren't very many people worried about going to 2 services. I think that's probably the best thing, right? So you go and you listen to the church. You can do that with town hall meetings. You can do it with focus groups. So the whole council could say, okay, everybody on the council, what's 2 groups in the church that you're familiar with? And you need to go to them, say what the problem is, listen to them, and then we'll get back together and talk about it. So Somebody goes to the youth group, somebody goes to the adult Sunday school class, somebody goes to the women's group, somebody goes to the choir, right? So here's the problem, and let's get your feedback, and then they get together. That's focus groups. But the point is that the council only moves forward with decision-making when they feel like they know what the congregation would support. If they don't, then they have a conversation. What they don't do is say, everybody come to the council meeting, we'll have a big debate, and we'll have a vote, and we'll have winners and losers, right? Before we even had a chance to think it through well. Instead, the council says, we're not ready for a plan. Let's listen, make a plan, listen to the congregation about that. We'll keep working on the plan until we get one that by the time we go to a vote, it's going to be 95%. In the last 5 years that I was in Minville, we did not have a single congregational vote that was less than 90% because we did the discernment work before we went to winners and losers. If you go 2 years without a town hall meeting, you're trusting yourselves too much and your congregation too little, right? You need to keep listening to the congregation, but what our congregations don't need is a whole lot of votes. What they need is more holy conversation and leaders who take that information and then develop strategies that the congregation will support. Surveys and Facebook and all those things can be used. There's one thing that's profoundly different about any kind of a survey, whether it's social media or whatever, although social media like Facebook can provide a little bit of this, but when you're in a town hall meeting, people not only express their own opinion, they hear everybody else's.
Sure.
And that's a different dynamic. There's something about Holy Council. That's why in the Methodist system, by the way, it does not allow proxy voting. You can't send a letter to the meeting saying how you vote. It's against the discipline. And the reason is because if you weren't there for the discussion, how do you know what your vote would be, right? You've discerned before the discernment, right? So you just do want to be careful with surveys. They're really great for getting specific data, right? Like, what is your favorite time to go to worship, right? And give them choices, because that is their opinion and that's all you want. But most churches end up doing surveys that actually confuse them more than help them.
But it's
That is where I hear anxiety, is that the sense that for some folks, like the people who we wish were part of this conversation left a long time ago.
Right.
And others saying, well, if we don't do it that way, we won't be included.
Right.
So I hear a lot of pain over this sense that why aren't we included?
How we communicate is generationally fractured, right?
Yes.
Which makes it hard. I will
And
tell
then it's
you,
exacerbated by power groups. There are
Absolutely.
people who love and are loyal to each other, sometimes against the good of the larger body.
right, so I will tell you, Matt, this is where we get back to being simple, right? It's a tough one. But it doesn't address the generational thing. I would highlight there that our stewardship ministry team, the group responsible for fundraising in the congregation, about halfway through my time there said, okay, we realize now we need 3 different fundraising campaigns. Our pledge campaign isn't one thing, it's 3, because how we talk to millennials, how we talk to Gen Xers, and how we talk to boomers has to be done completely differently. Not just the means, but even the message, right? Because we can tell silent generation and boomers, here's the budget and we need everybody to step up 5%. And they go, okay, I'll do my duty. And when we talk to Gen Xers that way, they say, why? Why do I have to do that? What's the reason, right? So the Gen Xers, they had to talk about why. And millennials, they had to just get them all excited about how they could be involved, right? So they had to, learn to communicate to the different constituencies of the church, not a different message, but a different way. But I will say that if you get clear and intentional about who you are good at reaching, too many churches go, who should we be reaching? Well, obviously the poor and obviously young people. I mean, it's such an easy answer, but we often do that without any skills to actually do it, right? And I often talk about McMinnville aiming at middle-aged professionals because that's who we were, which to a lot of people would say, well, that's cheap, what about the poor? Well, 8 years later, we're doing $150,000 of direct ministry to the
Exactly.
poor. And poor people are joining the congregation, right? Because we started by using the gifts God has given us to reach the people those gifts are well aimed at. And by doing that, our giftedness grew, right? To those to whom little has been, have been trusted. You do what you should with that, you get more, right? So that's the church council. Their job is tending the vision and the major strategy. They do not, if Rashinda has for you detailed agendas for those meetings, which by the way are 5 hours long. Those 4 meetings are 5-hour meetings with a meal. Because you're talking about really, and by the way, almost zero absences. Because there were such interesting meetings. Our people did not miss them who were on those councils. But it tells how do you do that? How do you tend the vision? How do you look back? How do you look up? How do you look forward? How do you look around? How do you do a meeting where that actually happens there? And they're very engaging because it's really important work. Now, I will say that in every case, I know of churches come onto this, by the end of the first year or so, a couple of people have come to the pastor or the chair of the committee and said, you know what, I see why this is important, but I hate doing this. I just want to go do something, right?
Oh,
And those people are great ministry team leaders, right? But they find out this work, it's not higher work, it's not more honorable, it's not more important. It's a particular kind of work that needs to be done. And over here is ministry team leading, which is actually where the mission hits the road, right? So we help people find the right place. And you'll find that you have some people in the church who are really good leaders to do that kind of work and aren't doing anything right now. Because when's the last time you had those conversations? Okay, another committee, the only other elected committee, so the only elected officers in the church are the church council and this committee, the nominating committee, or as it's called in the discipline now, the Committee on Lay Leadership and Nominations. And it has 5 to 11 members. In a church like Camas, I would say it's 5, right? It's the pastor, the lay leader, and 3 other people elected to 3-year terms. The responsibility is to identify, call, and equip leadership for the church. That includes nominating people for the council and the nominating committee each year when it's time to elect officers. But it also means helping to find in the congregation people who have leadership ability, help them develop that. It might be to lead a ministry team. It might be to go into the ministry. It might, whatever, right? But it's a group of people specifically charged with asking the question, ongoing and continually, who are the emerging leaders in our congregation? What do we need to be able to do with them and for them so they can grow in their leadership and so that they can serve the mission of our church? The authority is nominations. The accountability is to the pastor and the vision and values of the congregation. And while the council only needs to meet 4 times a year plus the all-church meeting, I recommend that nominating committee meets every month. This should be a hard-working, significant ministry team because helping people come to the most full expression of their discipleship is really the key work of the church. And there is another whole workshop on how they can do that work, which is not recruiting. Staff, the pastor is the chief of staff. Every person who leads a ministry team is a staff person. I told you that already. The responsibility of the pastor is to nurture and align the ministries of the church toward the fulfillment of the vision. The responsibility of each ministry team person is to lead their ministry team in fulfilling the responsibility that's been assigned to them. So if it's the bazaar, and the mission of the bazaar is to raise money for mission, I'm just making one up, I suppose that's it. The ministry team leader's job is to recruit together the people who can run a bazaar that ends up with money for mission at the end of the event, right? So that's the job of staff. The authority is personnel, financial, strategic authority as delegated by the council to fulfill the vision. Accountability is to the church council and the district superintendent. For the pastor, for the ministry team leaders, the other staff, the accountability is to the pastor. So remember that structure diagram. All the ministry teams, along through the pastor. The number of staff is unlimited because it isn't just the people you can afford to pay, it's the people who lead stuff. So it's equal to the number of things that your church can do. I always hesitate to highlight that it's unlimited, though it is, because most churches are doing too many different things to do them well. Most Methodist churches are doing too many things. So part of what most of our churches need to do is get clear about which things are really serving their mission and to focus a little more on those. And you don't do that by killing things. You do that by getting clear about your mission, and then people begin to align with that, right? Some groups say, wait a minute, we've been doing this, but if we do it this way, it'll serve our vision better. Other groups say, people in other groups say, I'd rather do that. now that I understand where we're going, I'd rather help with that. And some things fade and die on their own, some things realign, and some new things are born because somebody says, wait a minute, we need this to be happening, and they get a ministry team together to do it. But the pastor is the alignment person who keeps those people from tripping over each other and helps them to understand their place in the whole system. Does that make sense to you? I've had a lot of people say, well, eventually can't you have too many ministry teams for the pastor to handle? And the answer is, well, yes, except it doesn't take the same amount of time to align every ministry team. So the annual family retreat in McMinnville had a ministry team leader and a ministry team that planned the retreat. It happened every April. They started in February to plan. The weekend at Magruder was always, reserved a whole year ahead. So in January, I'd call up the person who's the ministry team leader, say, you guys ready to get started? Do you have everything you need to get going? And, that was it. Then afterwards, I'd call them up and say, so how did it go this year? Was it, did it work the way you wanted it to? And I'd help them work through the evaluation process. But I didn't have to meet with that team every time they met. They did it, right? But the Sunday morning children's program leader, I met with once a month. How's it going? As the pastor leading the worship, I couldn't go see how it was going. Key program. So the pastor has to decide how much alignment and communication do I need with each ministry team person and modulate that so that it's not too much for the person and not enough. And that is a judgment call, but nobody can do that if they just don't kind of continuously do that. So we had a weekly staff meeting that had about 5 people at it. We had a monthly staff meeting that had about 15 people at it. And then we had other contact that was much more episodic. Questions about that?
Yeah. Where does finance and trustees,
Good question.
SPRC, fit into this model? Are they ministry teams?
So yes and no. And so let me start with trustees because it's the clearest, easiest example. The council has all of the policy authority of the trustees. So that single board is the trustees for disciplinary authority. But your church will want to have a staff person called facilities coordinator. That person will be accountable to the pastor, but will be delegated authority by the council to keep the facilities up. And what happens is there is no trustees committee, because what there is a facilities ministry team.
Oh, teams.
Yeah, right, and because they're not elected, right? In fact, the church hires, and in McMinnville we had a job description for the facilities coordinator, we called it. Actually, it's in the book on leadership and organization. A job description, 20-hour-a-week job description, no pay, unpaid, facilities manager. All of our facilities managers, over a 12-year period, we had 3 different ones, were people who had been trustees chair, hated trustees chairing, loved being the facilities manager. The maintenance budget was their budget, right? Delegated to them. Authority to use the budget delegated to them. And they recruited a team of people to help with stuff around the church. As a matter of fact, much of the time that I was there, the facilities manager had a paid custodian that they managed. even though the facilities manager wasn't paid, right? They were volunteer trustees chair and had to run all that stuff and have meetings, right? As facilities manager, they had no meeting responsibilities. They could just accept staff meeting, met with the staff to make sure they were coordinating with us. And worked great. I've done this with several churches besides my own now. I've gone through this, and it's always the trustees that say, how's this going to work? And then later you go back and that former trustees chair is the facilities manager and say, I love this now. You know, I come in on a Tuesday and this needs to be done, I get it done. I call George, he does it. We don't have to have committee meetings. We don't have to worry about insurance. You know, that stuff is handled by the policy group, which is the board, and I take care of the building so that it's ready for our ministries. I may have a paid custodian. I have these 5 guys I know that will paint if I need painting done. I know who will fix the toilet if that needs to be done. And by the way, if something goes really wrong, I can call the plumber, and I don't have to have a meeting before I have the authority to do that. Because I'm managing a budget, right? They have to work within the boundaries. They have a budget. So that policy goes to the board, and management goes to the staff person. Okay? Same thing with finance. The board will set the policies around how often do we need an audit, how often do we need, and what kind of reports does the council want about finance. And actually, what kind of reports does the council want finance to provide to the pastor every month so that somebody is overseeing that we're staying on budget. And the council looks at that every quarter when they meet. But then on the other side of it, on the ministry team side, is, well, somebody has to keep the books, right? There's the bookkeeper or the treasurer that keeps the books. There's the finance secretaries deposit the money. They're carrying out the policy, and they're ministry team people. They don't have to have committee meetings. They have to do their work the way that it's supposed to be done according to the policy. Several churches nowadays, completely apart from this governance process, but there are a lot of churches now that hire a bookkeeping service. So their treasurer is on the finance committee but doesn't actually write the checks. The bookkeeping service writes all the checks because it's too much hassle. So you just need to understand that check writing is not a management function. That's just a job that needs to be done right and accountably. So the accountability body is the council, and the ministry team follows the policies and provides the reports required and so on. So that's finance. SPRC, the council is the SPRC. And it's just that simple. All the paid staff, however, will be managed by the pastor. So when this system is used fully, the pastor has hiring and firing authority over all paid staff, except for him or herself. And the council is who meets with the DS, says, we need a different pastor, this pastor isn't responding to our needs, or this is terrific, please don't move them. That's the council. Beginning to see this is different. Right? What the council is and how ministry teams work is different than what we're used to.
I have just a...
Yes.
So the council sets all the policies?
Correct.
Finance, SPRC, all of that?
Correct.
And the ministry teams then carry out those...
Exactly
that
right.
process?
Exactly right.
How do you make the transition from here to there?
So I will say that the first year is kind of challenging for people. But it's actually challenging, not the way people think it will be. People think, who will do all the work? Well, here's the deal. Every bit of work that is currently being done, the same people will do it. Most of them will be doing it in ministry teams instead of on elected committees. And at first, for a very short period of time, there'll be a little confusion of, well, can I do this? As a matter of fact, pastors going through this thing, what they frequently report to me is, people keep asking me, how do I get permission to do this? And the answer is, you already have permission, right? What people can't get their head around is, when is the committee meeting going to happen that votes that I can do this? You don't have to have that happen, right? So the hardest part for the things that happen is for people to realize they don't have to get permission to go ahead. They are a ministry team leader. That ministry team has a responsibility, free to go. So on the ministry team side, the hard part is to get people to realize, go ahead. You've been doing it, do it, right? On the council side, the hard part is they get together and they want to talk about every single ministry and whether it's okay to do that way and all that kind of stuff, right? They want to manage the ministries like they have been. And the hard part is getting the council to do the work that it's actually supposed to be doing, which is to evaluate last year, take a good look at how we're doing this year, and think about next year. Yeah.
One other question. Okay, so right now we have finance and we have
Trustees and SPRs.
So, but in that group, we have someone who's like in the trustees manages the investments that we have.
Right.
And we have someone in the finance who sets policy for applying for summer camp.
Right.
All
right.
that happens in the council now?
So one of the things that usually you want to do as you're moving into this system is the stuff that's currently policy. So like if you have a memorial fund and there's some kind of policy about what it can be spent on or something, you want to gather those things, not write new ones or anything, just gather that stuff into a policy manual. Here's our memorial fund, here's our camp fund, here's how it works. The people who raise the money for the camp scholarships and who decide who gets the scholarships become a ministry team. And there's a policy that's already there about how they do that. It may not have been written down before, but they've just been doing it this way. And so we write that down. This is how it's done, right? But that becomes a ministry team that does it, including decide how to give the scholarships away. Right?
So it's not the council then in that case?
They don't have to, because, so here's the deal. The council sets the boundaries. So what that means is if, for example, you had a group that was raising money and giving camp scholarships, and it was starting to cause all kinds of controversy because they said, well, only white kids can get these scholarships. I'm just going to make something up completely bogus, right? We decided over in this ministry team, only white kids can get scholarships. It would be the council's job then to say, not allowed, not within our values. Pastor, that ministry team cannot function that way. But you don't have to say what can't be done until you have a problem, right? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so the staff in that case would set the policy for applying for scholarships.
Exactly.
And the person who managed the trustees' accounts would also be a staff person.
Exactly right. Because the council has the authority over that, but they delegate the authority. Remember, here's your responsibility, here's your authority. So they say to the facilities manager, your responsibility, and this is a way, I mean, you need way more clarity than this, but your responsibility is to keep the building welcoming for the ministries that we do here. And your budget is $35,000 a year to keep it up. And, right, and you need to report to us to the pastor every week, how much money you've spent so far. Although actually what you would probably say is over here on the treasurer's side, we want a monthly report on what's been expended in every segment of the budget, including what the facilities manager has spent of their budget. So the pastor can say, wait a minute, it's March, and the facilities maintenance budget is 3/4 gone. How, what's going on with that, right? That's the accountability thing. But none of that, the council doesn't have to do that. They've said this is how that communication will take place. Right.
If your facilities manager has a budget
Mm-hmm.
and something comes up, say like we have dry rot on the back of the church, where does he get the money?
Good question. So let me tell you a specific story, okay? In McMinnville, when I was there, we hosted Walk to Emmaus every once in a while. Anybody know Walk to Emmaus? So we were having a women's weekend in the church, Thursday night through Sunday afternoon. 70 women living in our church building. Not much more facility than you guys have here. I get a call on Friday morning. They come in on Thursday night. I get a call on Friday morning from the church secretary. Steve, none of the toilets in the building are working. They're all backed up.
Yeah.
I say, call Ron. Ron is the facilities manager. Already called him. He's on the way. I'm on the way, right? We get there. Ron has already called Gormley Plumbing to come over and figure out what's wrong. As soon as he got there and found out, yep, not a single toilet in the place is draining. So Gormley comes, run the camera down the sewer line. Your sewer line to the street from the church to the main is collapsed. Not surprising, it's 100 years old, you know. Ron says, how soon can you fix it? They say by 2 o'clock this afternoon if you tell us to get going. How much will it cost? $8,000. Now his total maintenance budget for the year is $40,000, right? 8,000 is way not in that maintenance budget. Ron and I are standing there looking at each other on Friday morning. There's 70 women living in the building. We said, do it. Friday afternoon, we called the council. We're meeting Sunday afternoon, right after church, to talk about what to do about the $8,000 we've just spent, right? And because what we knew, Ron and I, because we knew the church well, Ron had been trustee's chair for 10 years before, you know, at various times before, we knew the church was not going to say, don't fix the plumbing, right? Right? So we made the executive decision, but Ron was designated as the facilities manager to do that kind of decision making. He wasn't authorized to spend the $8,000, but he also knew this is an emergency that has to be dealt with. Well, council said this is how we're going to backfill that budget. They did a thermometer thing, you know, buy a section of sewer, and the church donated additional funds, paid the $8,000. But what I'm trying to get at is that the kind of decision that Ron Pittman needed to make as the facilities manager wasn't made any differently than if he had been trustee's chair.
I was going to say, it sounded
Exactly right. But the way that would happen is exactly the same. He did know that out of the 40,000, he had more than 8,000 still in the bank. So he, you know, the check wouldn't bounce. He did know that, right? Same issues.
I think some of it is that we have to maybe start thinking about ways of trusting people with delegated authority. Trusting that we will be able to backfill if there are mistakes made, that it's not the end of the world, to lift the fear of failure, that somehow if we give delegated responsibility to Rashinda and she completely blows it and trips in the middle of everything and destroys every pew in one go, that we'll all survive it, that the church will survive, that we'll be okay.
Well, there
so
is that
power of delegation, that trust, and we are going to be talking to each other and in community with each other. So this isn't, the silos in a lot of ways have less accountability than this sort of trusting each other with the work.
Well, actually, that's true, but what I also want to highlight at this juncture in your consideration is that that in fact you delegate a lot right now. It's just not explicit. For example, Ron Pittman knew he had to make the decision because in the current system it would be the trustees have to decide. And any one trustee could have said, Ron, what did you do that for? Right? We didn't have a meeting. So to be explicit about delegation of authority actually gives everybody higher confidence.
You're putting together the budget.
Yes, that each year the council, once a year, they're going to make a budget, and they are not going to start by sitting down at that fourth meeting and go, so what should we do with the money this year, right? So what that council, but they own the budget. The council is going to decide the budget. So what they're going to do is they're going to say to probably three members of the council at the third meeting, the three people who are good at this kind of stuff on the council, we want you to go, work with the ministry teams, work with the pastor, and come to us with a basic proposed budget. How much should go into each of the major areas that we are working in. Then, when we decide on major goals for next year, we'll be starting with a kind of a budget already in place. It's based on what we'll probably raise next year. You know, it's all based on a real estimate of next year's revenue. It's based on the kind of the groups that are already working and what they're going to need to spend. It's based on what we know we spent on utilities last year, and it's going up 3%, so we'll need this much next year, right? And the council is not going to start from scratch this year. They're going to start with that, and they're saying, but we don't want to do as much Habitat for Humanity next year. We need some money for college ministry, and we're going to take some out of there and put over here. So they're not starting with nothing, right? And they actually have had three people maybe act as kind of a task force of the council in between to get ready and bring that to them.
Okay.
So, but the council owns the budget, but that doesn't mean they all have to sit all together and make it up, right? They can delegate to somebody What's our estimated revenue yet next year? What are the various ministry teams spending this year? So, yeah,
Yeah, that is, we have done some of that.
right,
We have done some of that
Right.
already, and it has worked better in accountability, back in accountability.
Exactly.
One way is to have each of the different committees and or ministries
say how much they
give
need.
an idea of, well, the same as last year,
Right.
or we need more, or we didn't use it all. Or
Exactly.
whatever. Okay.
So remember again, the council, I want you to hear this, how many places this applies. The council's job is to make the right decisions to help the congregation thrive at what it wants to do for God, right? And in order to do that, they really have to pay attention to when do we need to listen to the congregation, right? So when they're making a budget, they need to listen to the ministry teams that are already out there. They can't just sit in their ivory tower and go, I don't think the worship team needs any more money this year. You know what I'm saying? They need to actually gather information. So there's that. And then the second part of your little narrative about the budget is all the work that's being done before you do this kind of change still has to be done after you do the change if you're going to do the same things. Understand? None of this makes any work go away.
No.
Right? What it does do is for people who are engaged in ministry teams, make it easier for them to decide to adjust and to manage their own thing without having to keep going to a lot of other places to get permissions. That's what it does. So it makes it easier for people to do their work, especially certain parts of that work. But it doesn't make any work go away. I've had a lot of churches kind of afterwards say, well, gosh, a whole bunch of stuff stopped happening when we went to this. Well, why? Well, because everybody stopped doing stuff. We thought we could just stop doing stuff. No. Potlucks still need to have food at them, you know.
But I think this would reveal in some ways what is the will of the congregation.
Absolutely.
If that potluck is continuing, or the the popsicle fundraiser is every year, and nobody even wants to do it anymore, that's going to show up
Absolutely.
here. And so it frees people. It also opens the door for somebody to say, hey, I've got this great idea for a ministry. This is my ministry team. I'd like to lead it up. Does it fit with the vision of the church?
Right. So let me illustrate that. I mentioned the family retreat. Actually, at McMinnville, I mentioned how much I needed to talk to that ministry team leader. Well, 1 year in January, I called up the ministry team leader and said, so, how's it going for the retreat this year? And she said, we decided we don't want to do it again this year. Kind of ran its course. Last year, we didn't think it was that successful, and we don't want to do it this year. And I said, okay, fine. Right? The ministry team who does it doesn't want to do it, so that's fine. So that retreat was usually in April. So around the end of March, somebody came up to me after church and said, I haven't heard anything about the family retreat. And I said, yeah, I know. The team that does that didn't want to do it this year. Oh, so it's not going to happen? No, not unless somebody wants to make it happen, right? And she said, oh, that's too bad. I have never done anything with that, but I kind of thought I'd go this year, right? So I said, well, that is too bad. But if anybody wanted to do something with that, we could easily put a team together and get going, right? So they didn't go that year. There was no retreat. But actually in about November the next year, so 2 or 3 months earlier, this same young woman came up to me with 5 other couples, all new people in the church, and said, we would really like to have a family retreat. Can we do that? Absolutely. And that started a whole new life with, by the way, actual families. That family retreat had become a whole bunch of 60-year-old people who were, had been going since they had, kids with them, and they didn't want to do it anymore. And by the way, when a young family showed up, it was kind of like, oh, geez, what are we going to do to entertain these young people? And there's only one young family, and they're looking around going, where's all the other families? So that's what Rashida's talking about. The thing about ministry, standing committees are under obligation to keep something going. Right? Ministry teams, when the ministry team's done, they're done. They're not a standing committee. They weren't elected to a 3-year term to make sure this happens, right? So, and so what happens is when you go to this ministry team kind of structure, every once in a while something doesn't happen, and sometimes nobody notices. That's actually surprisingly often. Sometimes somebody does notice, and when you say, well, if you'd like that to happen, get a team together and let's talk about how you can do it. They say, no, I don't want to do it. I just want somebody else to do it, right? Well, sorry, that's not the way it works around here. And sometimes somebody comes and says, no, we do want it to happen, and we're going to do it, and we're happy to do it. We're not obligated to do it, we're glad to. And then, of course, the fourth thing, which happens surprisingly often. So, again, I'll give you a specific example because I think it helps to see how this works. McMinnville's, one of their focuses was hunger. And so we had a preaching series on hunger and how it's not just about cooking or bringing canned goods. There's, the question is, what are you good at and how could that help feed the hungry in our community? And after that Sunday, that sermon, Jim Dayton walked up to me and he said, you know what, I've been, ever since you said that about what's your gift and how could it help the hungry, he said, I love karaoke. Every Thursday night I go to James in Newburgh and Dundee and we sing karaoke, my wife and I, but I especially like 1950s street corner doo-wop, like New Jersey doo-wop. And he said, what if I got a quartet of guys together and we practiced up a show of doo-wop and we sang and charged money or took donations and gave the money to the food bank? I said, great idea, Jim. Got anybody in mind? And so he said, yeah, I know 3 or 4 guys I might talk to. So he did. He got these 3 other guys. They called it the Occasional Quartet. This was in 2008. Today, the Occasional Quartet still travels around McMinnville, Salem, Western Oregon. They've raised over $35,000 for hunger ministries. And they're having a blast, right? Now, nowhere in the world would a church council or a mission committee ever say, let's find some people to sing street corner doo-wop to raise money for food ministry, right? It happened because the vision of the congregation to address issues of hunger in the community caught fire in somebody's imagination. And they sell CDs of their group. And I mean, it's kind of astounding what's happened because of that. But that's the difference between a ministry team-focused work and a committee-focused way of being engaged in ministry. You've got your all-church meeting, which is run by the church council, right? Which is where you share the mission and vision and the budget and elect officers. And you've got those 4 council meetings. But as you've noticed in this concluding conversation, we used to call this single board governance. I now just call it simple governance. The reason is ministry teams are really the key to this. Ministry teams are where the power of this happens. The governance is really important in terms of helping the congregation to realize we have a purpose together. And then ministry teams are all the ways that various people with various gifts and various interests and various passions and various amounts of time find ways to get personally engaged in helping the church to fulfill that vision. And the misfires that happen are when, in 2 ways. One, when the council doesn't do vision, strategy, right? They don't delegate that authority. If they get together and meet every month and decide who can be on the calendar and who can't, and whether they can charge $3 for the bazaar or whether it should be an offering for the dinner. If they do that, it won't make any difference, right? The governance part is about taking seriously that work of figuring out what is God calling us to be, what's the giftedness that we have, and how do we begin to see that and move that direction. That's the governance part, and the other part is these ministry teams that and you'll have to keep telling them you don't have to do that. Because we're all used to this duty. There was a committee, I was elected to it to make sure there's flowers on the altar every Sunday. Well, not if you're not called to it. And you also have to resist that thing when somebody says, well, there used to be flowers on the altar every Sunday, and I noticed there haven't been any. Because the answer is, would you like to bring flowers? And if the answer is no, somebody should be doing that. That's not the way we do it here. Right? If you care about flowers, we'd love to have you get involved in working with the worship team around flowers. Right? In other words, nobody gets to report what somebody else should be doing. And that's the problem with committees, is committees are precisely there so that when somebody reports this should be done in your area, you know, we need a second and third grade Sunday school class, or somebody needs to do confirmation for me. Committee's job is to make sure that happens, or to say no, but it doesn't empower people. So a big part of this is that shift to thinking there are ministry teams, everybody here is a minister. Get involved with the ministry team, create one, whatever, that's your way of being involved. Because you don't have to take your turn on.
I have one quick
Sure.
question for trustees.
Yes,
If the trustees have a problem that was not known about and wasn't budgeted for,
yes,
and there's a very limited budget, and they don't know where they're going to get the funds, they don't have $40,000
Right.
set aside. Okay? Do you defer it another year and have more things happen?
right. So the answer is, if the facilities manager has an emergency that comes up that is not in the budget and there isn't money to do it, the facilities manager will go to the church council and they will work in exactly the same way as they would in the current system you're in if you have something come up that there's no money for. Together the church has to decide what to do about that, right? That's not any different. What's different is that the facilities manager, if it isn't that kind of situation, can go ahead and get things done without a meeting. If it is that kind of situation, the facilities manager and the pastor, who's the supervisor, need to get the council to have a special meeting and decide what are we going to do. If the roof is gone and we can't replace it, do we sell the building and move out? It's the same problem you would have if it was the trustees. It's just the council that has to do that work. So when I say only have 4 meetings a year, that's going to be most years true, but they can have an emergency meeting. And that happens when the pastor and the facilities manager call them all and say, next Sunday, right after church, we're meeting because here's the problem, right? That leak that we thought was just a couple of shingles turns out to be the whole roof is rotten and it's about to fall on our heads. What are we going to do about that? So emergencies don't come or go depending on your governance structure, right? An emergency that your budget won't handle is an emergency whether you're in simple governance or complicated governance, right? And you're going to have to figure out together as a church. I will say that with simple governance, your church council is going to be responsible for figuring out what to do, and that board has been, if it's functioning well, thinking about what is God calling us to do, who are the people we're called to reach, and they're going to decide that based on the whole context of who we are. When we have trustees over here and council over here, the trustees often do not function on the basis of the mission of the church, because it's not their job.
So how's the communication to know what's going on in the ministry teams and get communicated out to?
When we say the job of the pastor is alignment of the ministries, so the first and basic step in carrying out that function of alignment is that the pastor is creating a communication network among the ministry teams that's adequate for them to function smoothly together. So the first thing is, the first kind of communication is internal among the ministry teams through the pastor as the sort of network hub to make sure that, for example, if the choir decides that they don't want to sing on Mother's Day because they're all going to their children's for Mother's Day, that the worship team knows there's not going to be a choir on Mother's Day, right? So it's that kind of thing, right? Or the youth group decides to have a lock-in retreat in the church basement, and it turns out it's the same weekend as the rummage sale, that the pastor is going, wait a minute, let's talk because that's not going to work. So the first level of communication responsibility is the pastor's management of the communication between all these ministry teams so that they're aligned, right? So that what we're doing helps each other instead of hurting each other. The second kind of communication that matters is, do the people who need to know there's a rummage sale find out? Do the people who need to know there's a youth group login find out? Do the people who might want to sing in a choir find out that they're not singing right? So think about it. One is internal communication, right? Do we know what we are doing well enough not to stumble on each other? The other is outward communication. Do the people who might participate in these things know they're there and who's invited and what would happen if they showed up? And the council and the pastor need to help the church get more savvy about that communication, because frankly, most of our church people only do the internal. They only communicate towards the center, because when we're trying to reach other people and new people, we have to ask, how do we get in touch with them on their terms? So that's the other side of the communication, and that's a hard lesson. I would say as a matter of fact, you never have to quit working on that. You never get to quit working on that. You constantly have to help ministry teams learn how do you actually get the word to the people you want to participate.